Welcome, everyone. Glad you're here with us today. We're continuing through 1 Corinthians. We're here and we're moving, and we're in a really fascinating section. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is a place I haven't spent a whole lot of time, so I'm learning a lot of really, really cool things. If there's something you're learning, something that's interesting to you, some questions you've got, drop that in the comments below if you're watching somewhere, or send us a message, reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram or the podcast email. We'd love to hear from you, hear what you're thinking about these things, especially if you got a question. Send that over, and we'll circle back to those for our question and response episode. I'm really excited to hear about that and to share those things with you. There's tons of questions. We've already gotten more questions at this point, I think, in the process than we've ever really had. So it may be several weeks and several months, but lots of good and important things to consider. So with that, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to 15. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become evident. For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each one's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet only so as through fire. This week, Paul's going to continue his discussion from last week, but with a slightly different emphasis, which he'll tie in a bow next week. So really, in some sense, you really need verses 8 to about verse 20 or so to really make sense of all of this. But here we are, 15 minutes at a time. The next several weeks, or I guess the last several weeks rather, he's been talking about the role of gospel laborers in the work of the Lord and all these things. And the Corinthians had elevated their teachers to where they were identifying themselves by the teachers rather than, most tragically, by Jesus. And so it doesn't seem a far stretch they were idolizing these teachers, even to the point of nearing objects of faith. And instead, Paul has declared that such an attitude is purely carnal. It's evidence of their carnality, especially when it's mixed with envy and strife. You know, we can have an admiration and an appreciation and a love for the people who taught us the gospel. It's, Paul obviously had that with several people. When that begins to be mixed with strife and envy, that tells us something is off here. We're not connected enough to Jesus. They have no significance, these gospel teachers do. They plant and water in a field, but it's God who gives the increase. God and Christ are the primary thing. Further, Paul shares that preach of the Gospels, especially he and Apollos, they're on the same team, they're doing the same work, and trying to set themselves against each other is ludicrous because they're not adversaries. Paul transitions from talking about the church as a field to using a metaphor of a building to describe the church, and he has in mind a temple, which will be explicitly clear next week. If you've listened last week and this week, you're like, is it really a temple or not? Just wait till he actually says it next week, and it'll be totally clear. Paul said that while gospel laborers are working towards the same goal, they need to take care how they work and teach. In fact, he explicitly declares that they must build on the foundation of Christ exclusively. Today, he's going to unpack how we should think of laborers who are still connecting people to Christ, but maybe they're taking shortcuts, maybe they're circumventing things, maybe whatever it is. Today's big idea is how you preach matters. How you preach matters. For supporting ideas, number 1, converts are work. Number 2, work will be tested. And number 3, work will be exposed. Converts are work will be tested, and work will be exposed. So converts, tested, and exposed. I thought about making those final 3 words work, but decided not to do that. Paul starts by introducing these various materials that one could use to build on a building that may have been common in their building practices. And he lists them, I'll argue, in 2 specific groups. Gold, silver, precious stones, kind of one group, and then wood and hay and straw. And the permanence and flammability of these materials is really important, and that explains these groupings, right here separately. In this case, these materials really refer to different types of people and specifically different types of work that a person may do. Remember, the whole context here, if we need to think about this carefully, because if we lose this, we're going to be in a very strange place understanding this. The whole context here is Paul is exhorting people to remember how they build. In this way, when someone is added to the church, they're a component of the temple of God. They are gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw. They're one of these things. To pull from the image from 1 Peter 2, where the church is talked about as a temple, he says there that Peter does that each of us are living stones, which, sounds very Christian until you realize it means it's a rock that is alive, which is really something. But it means the rock is growing into place. It's this building material isn't static. It's put there for a purpose to grow, and to grow into a role that God has for it. The picture here is we all form a different part. As we mentioned, the image of the church as a temple and as a body, they're very similar. As different body, or just in our bodies, there's different tissues and muscles and ligaments and bones and other substances that I don't know a whole lot about. In a building, there's different types of stones and ornamentations that make up that building and its compositeness. As you read about the temple and the tabernacle in the Old Testament, all sorts of materials, and it adds to its beauty, its splendor, and its glory. And when we're properly added to the church, we become a testament to the glory and the majesty of God, that when people come that don't know God and they see that, they have an experience with God through us, that we represent what he's like. And we reflect the greatness of what God has done in us. However, as you see here, there's some substances that are skeptical in their ability to contribute to the endurance and the elegance of the temple. As we come to this second idea that we hinted at, Paul says each one's work will be evident. Each person's work will be evident. The way in which a person is built on the house of God, that is the way in which they're made a disciple, is going to be put to the test. The way in which I work personally to preach the gospel and sharing right now in this very format is planting and watering, and how that I do with that and how this whole thing works is going to be brought into judgment. It's not going to be hidden forever. If it's destructive, that'll be exposed. If it's helpful, that'll be exposed. And Paul says the day will declare it. And when we see the words the day without any context, this is referring to the day of the Lord, which is a deep topic, an extensive biblical theme that fortunately for me, unfortunately for me today, I guess is very controversial in some areas. So regardless, without defending my position, which I would do if you want to ask in a Q&R, hashtag drop that in the comments, hashtag send us an email in the show notes. We're just going to say this refers to the return of Christ. I can't untangle all that. I'm not saying it always does. I'm just saying here that seems to be what he's talking about, especially when we get into chapter 4. I think that's a lot clearer. The notions of things being tested and laid bare and judged by fire. I don't know if fire is actually in chapter 4, but other places where Paul talks about the return of Christ. Okay. All right. On that day, regardless, if you take that, we'll all be put to the test, and we'll have to answer for the things we've done. However, as incredibly important as this is, that's not Paul's concern, that we'll each be tested. The focus of this figurative language is that the fire will test our work in the gospel. The specific test he's talking about and mentioning that will occur is the people we've labored to bring to Christ, whether they endure to the end or not. In some sense, we don't really know what kind of Christian life a person is living. They've got counsels and secrets within their heart, as we talked about chapter 2. Only the spirit of man, the man within them, knows what sort of person they are. But on that final day, it won't be about projection or presentation or performance. It'll simply be, are they accepted by God or not? And this fire of testing will reveal that fact. The person will be put to test. And that's why Paul says, hey, it matters how you build, because there's a testing coming. It matters how you build, much like if you were to build in a place where there's earthquakes. It matters how you build because there's going to be an earthquake, and that will put it to the test. So you can't do this lackadaisically or sloppily. All right, finally, we get to the consequences of enduring or our work failing to endure. So it's our work enduring or failing to endure. And I want to stress this again. This work does not refer to generic actions of good. It refers to gospel advancement and discipleship. The work is the people we add to the church and work to add to the church. If this work remains, that is, this person endures to final salvation, will receive a reward. As we talked about last time, we're going to take that generally to refer to people's salvation and the joy we have in that in the hereafter, though, once again, send us an email, ask questions on that. So similarly, if that work is burned up, this person does not endure to final salvation, then we're going to suffer loss, but we will not lose our salvation because they did not endure. So let's catch that. Even though we'll suffer some sort of sadness or some sort of loss, we won't lose our salvation because people didn't endure. Now, as we circle back to the lesson for us, I want to make mention here about tracking this word work again, which I've done several times, but it's because there's two common readings of this text that I think are deeply problematic that just miss this plain contextual clue. I want to be charitable to that, but this is just unavoidable to me. The first is this is a major proof text for people who support the doctrine of purgatory, as though our bad deeds and sins are burned up, but we're still saved. And with respect to our Catholic friends and their sincerity, I don't believe that honors the context. The work here is things we do in the gospel to help people. Second, this is used as a proof text for perseverance of the saints. And while this does contribute to our assurance of salvation, to say that it guarantees final salvation to every Christian, someone who names the name of Christ in faith, and that one can't possibly abandon faith in Christ is outside the scope of this context. The contribution this makes to our surety of salvation is that if we're faithful to Christ, but we're ineffective in our ability to make disciples long term, we don't have to fear being cast out from Christ. That if I'm really trying to connect people to Christ and doing it in an honest heart, I might make mistakes, but that's not going to cost me my salvation. My good faith, honest mistakes in trying to connect people to Christ are not sin. But that's an exceedingly different position than this. If anything, it actually tends to the opposite position, in that people can be added to the church of God, but not endure to the end. And so this actually kind of moves in the opposite direction with charity there. So, like I say, those are two things that I think is kind of settle there are common, I think, misunderstandings on this text that'll leave for you to consider that in this case you can't really avoid it. A lot of times I try to take an agnostic position, but there you're kind of at a crossroads interpretively, and you can't not make a decision there. So that's what I believe is the best reading of the context, and leave that to your heart to judge, and to hopefully faithfully apply the Word of God. All right. So Paul's point throughout the situation, if we kind of step out of those debates, is back to verse 10, is each person must be careful how they build on the temple of God. An awareness that someone enduring this final salvation because of our manner of preaching the gospel or their failure to do so, that should be sobering. As we look and think about how we labor, we need to realize we're not going to get everything right. And Paul gives us confidence that as long as we're building on the foundation of Christ, we will endure to the end. But we do need to be mindful about what we're doing. We need to go boldly, because it's not like those mistakes will cost us our soul necessarily. But we do need to have an awareness that it does matter. It does matter what we preach and how we preach and the things that we preach. Our love for our fellow man should cause us to consider them and to make sure that we are effective. Because, they're going to be exposed one way or the other. They're going to be exposed as, a sinner on the day of judgment if we don't preach them the gospel. And so our best choice there is to try and be effective in that. And what we mean by effective here, notice Paul's definition of effective work, and how we should conduct ourselves is creating a disciple of Christ who remains a disciple for life. Remains a disciple for life, that they ultimately endure to the end. That's what effective work is that whole body of things. It's not about getting someone to a single decision. It's about the whole scope of things. And so effectiveness, when we preach here, needs to have this whole path in mind, because there's times that we can get someone to profess faith and be baptized, but they never really get connected to Jesus, and they just quickly fall away. And there's things we could say about, like, the parable of the sower, about that's just kind of their heart. But we also need to make sure we're not short-circuiting that process, that we're not short-circuiting the process. We can't view conversion just as a finish line, but we got to view it as a starting line. And we need to make sure that we give a robust enough gospel presentation in the beginning that it's not just a starting line thing, but that we're calling them into that entire Christian life, that entire Christian race, if you'll allow me those metaphors here. So as we think about that and what it means, are you considering how you build as a Christian? Just kind of stepping back, are you even working to build? Do you have a love for the lost and a love for the gospel such that you share it with them, so that they find, a way to avoid destruction on the day of the Lord? Do you strive to make sure they endure? Do you work to teach them and to continue to teach them, not just at this point, but the planting of the gospel in their hearts and then the watering of that as they continue to grow as a Christian? Have you ever tried to shortcut the full counsel of God or force them into a decision that ended up not lasting? How effective are you in your ministry? And can you just start a discussion with trusted Christians and trusted, faithful gospel workers on how to be more effective, both long-term and short-term, looking for that reward both for them and for you, ultimately leading to the glory of Christ? Thanks so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: how you preach matters.